welcome everybody. I'm Bob Johnson, one of the 23 members of the board of the Enterprise Forum. We're all volunteers and we all work hard to come up with interesting and educational programs, and I think this should be another one. We've been doing this in Santa Barbara for almost 25 years, which was a surprise, I think, to all of us to find out it had been going on that long. And a little history of the MIT Enterprise Forum just worldwide. The precursor to it was a venture clinic that got started in New York City in 1971, and that kind of grew pretty rapidly. In 1978, the first formal Enterprise Forum was started in Cambridge, Mass., obviously right at MIT. And now there are 24 chapters all over the world. Santa Barbara is the smallest population center that has one, which I think says something about us and our entrepreneurial instincts. As I said, we started almost 25 years ago. Now, people are always asking me, why does MIT do this? Because this is not, just for MIT alums, it's for anybody who's interested. And basically the answer is that for almost 150 years now, MIT's mission has been to bring science and technology into the mainstream, into practical use for the benefit of everybody. And entrepreneurial efforts, we believe, are one of the best ways to do that. The Kauffman Foundation, which studies entrepreneurial things, just issued a report a couple months ago where they looked at the impact of MIT on kind of the economy. And the determination they came to was that there are about 110,000 living MIT alums, and they have founded 26,000 companies. So that's almost one company for every 4 alums. Obviously, some alums form more than one and some don't do any. These 26,000 companies employ 3.3 million people, and they have revenues of in excess of $2 trillion. And as they pointed out in that report, taken together, that's the equivalent of the 11th largest economy in the world. So this is our DNA. It's something we've been committed to for a long time. We promote and support entrepreneurship. The Enterprise Forum is just one part of it. There are the Venture Mentoring Service, there's the Deshpande Center, and then there's a very interesting group of things called the International Development Initiative, which works in different countries around the world at a much simpler level in terms of the kinds of things that get started, but it's having a big impact. So, helping us to do all this good work locally are our sponsors, who you've been seeing up there on the screen. Our premier sponsors are Stradling Yelka, Carlson & Roth, Brian Johnson of the Radius Group, Bank of the West, the Riviera Insurance Services Group, CompuVision, Nassif Hicks & Harris, Ideocor, Vices, Express Employment Professionals, and the Pacific Coast Business Times. And for tonight, a special sponsor, an event sponsor, is Silicon Valley Bank. We have Mark Turk here from Westlake Village. Mark was a director and a board member of the Enterprise Forum for about 7 years, up until a couple of years ago. Supporting sponsors are the DuPont Displays Company up in Goleta, Alma Rosa, Mission Ventures, and NewsHawk. So the idea for tonight's program began more than a year ago. My wife Lisa, who's over here, and I were up doing one of the wine tasting things in the valley and just talking, and Lisa said, the wine business up here is just as entrepreneurial as that high-tech stuff that you guys talk about. And I thought about it and agreed, and we discussed it at a board meeting, and everybody thought that would be a good subject to explore. So we set about to do it. And tonight we've got 4 great participants. The lead off is Rob McMillan, who's the founder of Silicon Valley Bank's wine lending business, which was started many years ago. And Rob is going to be our keynote speaker, giving us sort of the 30,000-foot view of the business, worldwide and locally. And then Richard Sanford, who is known by all of us, founder of 3 wine businesses in 38 years, is going to give us a ground-level view. And then we have panelist Brett Escalera, who's been a winemaker for many of the brands we know well, and Jeff Newton, who's grown grapes for many of the brands we know well. And they'll introduce themselves a bit later on the panel and describe a bit more about what they do. The presentations by Rob and Richard will be first, then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience as we usually do. Tonight, as you can see, we have Santa Barbara channels, Channel 17 and 21, videotaping this program, and it'll be broadcast later this summer. This is our fourth of these videotapings. We started a year ago when we did the New News in Santa Barbara program, which won a WAVE Award for Channel 21 for the best public forum program in the 6 western states, which we all thought was terrific because, you know, we had just videotaped it. We didn't think about it as being in some kind of competition. And then this year, earlier, we did Still Funding the Web, which relates to funding early stage startups in the web area. And then last month, we did Pandora and the Music Genome Project, which was a very exciting program discussing a discussion between the old music business and the new music business and what a stark difference there is between them. We keep improving our production efforts. In the past, we've had difficulty with audience questions, getting them onto the tape. So tonight you'll see a microphone right up here, and we ask that you come up and ask your question there, and that way you'll be heard and you'll also be seen when it's later broadcast. So let's welcome Rob up here to get us started, and then we'll move on to Richard after that.
Thank you very much, Robert. Very nice of you. While we're getting my speech up here, I think I have to have a clicker as well, so I'll get that in a second. Just to get an idea where you guys are, name a couple of wine labels, just a couple of brands. Who do you buy? Omarosa is an excellent. It's an excellent vote. Tinselance, okay. Longoria is excellent. Jaffers, all local guys. What about some of the big ones? Cosentino, Silver Oak, Cakebread. What about Kendall Jackson? Remember that one? Maybe not as much down here. I don't know. So I'll tell you a story about myself. Back in the early '80s, I started in the banking business, and there was a crush pad that we were doing in Lake County, California, and back at that time, that was Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino. I don't know if you guys remember the '60s. They'd say if you do, then you're a liar. But back at that period of time, Italian Swiss colonies started advertising Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and those are the 3 premium grape growing regions at the time. So, starting off in my new job as a banker, we were making a loan to this attorney who was doing a crush pad off in Lake County making Chardonnay, and Chardonnay in Lake County just didn't make any sense at that time, and I told him that I didn't think he was going to make it. Well, as it turns out, that was Jess Jackson from Kendall Jackson Winery. So I reminded him when I sat next to him at lunch that I said that as a younger man, and he said, well, a lot of people don't think I've made it, and I said, no, trust me, you're good at this time. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides. I'm going to jump around a little bit. This is outside of my normal slide deck. Typically when I'm talking, today I'm talking mostly about the economy and a lot about things and trends in the wine business. So you guys are a little bit of a different group, so I might jump around a little bit. But this is what I heard. You guys all wanted to learn how you could retire from doing the real work that you're doing and own your own vineyard. So that's the overarching theme of what we're going to talk about. First, you got to understand the business itself. This business is incredibly cyclical, and it's violently cyclical at times. It's been that way forever. Father Junipero Serra was the first guy that brought grapes to this area, but they were mission grapes. They needed them for the sacrament. The monks, or the priests, pardon me, they did such a great job of doing that. By the middle of the 1800s, the Mexican authorities put this law in place that said, look, you got to split this up. You know, you're not taking care of the flocks, so, you know, leave this alone. So that was the first example of kind of this build and then drop. So fortunately, there were a bunch of Europeans here, and all over the state they start planting grapes. And those grapes start to come into being, and they're more the vinifera variety. So we got the mission grapes, which are a totally different variety than the vinifera grapes, which are more of the European varieties. The ones you know today, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, things like that, those are the vinifera. But once again, we have this big rise and a big fall. By the 1880s, we have this rampant phylloxera, which is a root louse that in the 1860s totally wiped out almost all of the European continent's grapes, and by 1880 it almost did the same thing here. So you had that again. Now we have big investments right at that same period. Wine business goes up, and then pretty soon we end up with prohibition. So that's the kind of ups and downs that we get in this business, and they go all over the place that way. I'm going to skip by this slide, except the one interesting thing I think up at the top, 560,000 people in 1870, half a gallon per capita. Now, I hear some of the MIT fraternities have that in Saturday, but it's not very much. So this is where wine has really come in this decade, coming out of the period of prohibition. We really had to go through this recovering of all aspects of winemaking. The vineyards needed to be brought back up to speed. Mostly during depression or the prohibition, it was depressing if you were in the grape business. But what people would do is they would sell some of the grapes for home winemaking. They would try to find ways to get through it. But generally speaking, most people didn't make it through there. But then again, we end up with the same ups and downs. In the early 90s, we end up with phylloxera. But we've gone through this long march from kind of quantity. My dad used to have a gallon of wine, Carlo Rossi, I think Hardy Burgundy, that he would store underneath the counter right next to the garbage disposal, so it was nice and hot. And so that's what we were raised with. And I drink a little better than that now. And so we've moved to this period of time where we've gone through this kind of quantity. More is better, $1.99 gallons to really quality in the 90s. And now we've kind of moved back into a period of value, and we'll talk about some of that in some of the other slides. In 1960s, one of the things that moved the industry the farthest was Gallo and Italian Swiss Colony. I don't know if some of you guys are not old enough, but if I said the little old winemaker, and there's an end to that, the little old winemaker, me. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. So that's the power of advertising. That many years later, there's people that remember those commercials, and TVs were black and white, by the way. So that was a very long time ago, but that's what happened to the wine business. It really started taking off at that period of time. And the Paris wine tastings were something that happened in France, where it was a blind tasting, and the wines were set out, California wines were set out against some of the French wines, and the California wines, for God's sakes, won. And that was just a gigantic storm, but that moved, again, the American wine culture, further forward. Somewhere in the 70s, because of the way the dollar was set against the French franc at the time, the business wasn't doing very well, and so Glen Ellen and Mondavi are normally accredited with this. They came out with what they call the Fighting Varietals, and that's what you know today as Cabernet, Pinot Noir, etc. If you go to Europe, you buy wines based on regions, so it's Bordeaux or Burgundy or the regions within there, and that defines what kind of grapes are grown in that region. We now have Cabernet, Pinot Noir, and that all came out of that era. Then you end up with the 80s. This is the era that women wore these leggings and the headbands and the jazzercise came out, and it was the end of two martini lunches, the end of culture as we knew it, honestly. So the whole thing started going to hell in a handbasket, and we started drinking more Barb's and James, which was good if you were 18. And we get to the bottom of that, and then the French paradox hits. You may have seen that one. It was on CBS 60 Minutes, and the whole question was, how is it that the French can smoke and drink like a fish, and still have recipes that start with a cube of butter and a pint of heavy whipping cream? Why are they living longer lives than Americans? And the whole thing got back to red wine, or wine in general, and so that's fueled this later expansion. Now there's another little blip in here with question marks. Anybody see that little blip, the little quick blip? Was it? Yeah, end of World War II. So those were happy days for at least that year. It was somewhere in 46. There was the wine consumption really went through the roof. Okay, this is where Santa Barbara. You're starting to think about, okay, where do I fit when I buy my vineyard? Where do I fit now that you've figured out that this thing is really volatile and you kind of got a sense for the history of it, and you're going to join the club? Where do you fit? Well, Santa Barbara is about 20,000 acres, and just to compare it to Napa, we'll use that as a benchmark. Napa is about 44,000 acres. Now, the difference between Napa, besides just the climates and the soils, the difference is that Napa's got 44,000 acres planted, and that's it. It's all planted. You can't really plant anymore in Napa. It's done. We still have quite a ways to go in Santa Barbara counties. So you can still find that vineyard if you want. Now let's look at returns. If you grower returns per ton, Pinot Noir in the Central Coast typically is going to get 3,000 a ton, plus or minus. And if you look at Napa, Napa doesn't do as well in that varietal. Switch out though to Cabernet Sauvignon, and you see that the Cabernet grapes actually return very nice yields very nice returns for the growers. Land costs. You go back to land costs, it's about 50,000 an acre. After you pull out housing sites and other such things, you get about 50,000 an acre. I'm going to skip by that slide. Here's Napa Valley prices. Each of those red little dots up there are acres that go for 250,000 an acre. So going back to that slide real quick, 50,000 at the top end, 250 in Napa. So that's a huge difference. If you're going to start a winery and you're going to start it in Napa or you're going to start it in the Central Coast, you got to have a pretty big pocketbook these days to do it in Napa, and you got to find the property. So let's look at the bottle prices. Really, your land values do link themselves up to bottle prices, and I won't tell you how this all came to be, but just trust me on this. If you have on the top line, you see retail shelf price of $25, $35, $45, $55. On the bottom, you have per acre loan costs in that. It's not blue. What color is that? I'm a primary color guy. Teal. There we go. Thank you. So in the bottom, you have in that teal section. So a $25 bottle of wine will support a $51,000 an acre property. So what that tells you is, at least in Santa Barbara County, you have to sell your wine for $25 to make a reasonable return. And I define a reasonable return as 12% pre-tax, which is still pretty weak, but that's the way I did that model. So it just gives you a little bit of an idea of what you're up against. Now the consumer, we're going to jump around with the consumer a little bit, but one of the things that is happening right now is you're seeing a decline in the consumption of wine in the higher price points. So the circle there is the $15 and above. This is Nielsen scan data, and it goes through year in 2006, 2008, and then 26 through 2009, 26 weeks. And you can see the growth rate in fine wine has come off 30%, and now it's down to roughly flat is where it is right this second. And the lower priced wines have actually held in there a little bit better. The term that we use in the business is called trading down. So that's one of the other things you're going to have to think about when you retire and get that vineyard. So this is one of the biggest questions I think that revolves around all consumer purchases. I don't care if it's a nice car or a nice watch or an expensive bottle of wine. Is this a consumer shift permanent? Personally, I believe, for all intent and purposes, it is. And we're going to go through a couple economic charts real quickly. This is the shedding of household net worth. We've lost trillions now in household net worth. We were used to running up our credit cards and then refinancing, running up our credit cards and refinancing. That's the way we financed the 90s largely. So you have to say, what's the consumer going to spend when they want to buy these expensive bottles of wine? It doesn't exist, at least in the way it did before. Next one, household debt to net worth. So the amount of your assets covered by debt is at an all-time high right now for the American consumer. That's an unfortunate prospect. But again, if you're going to go out and try to leverage your assets to try to get money to spend, if that's part of the wealth effect, you may have a difficult time. You may not be able to do exactly what you wanted to do at the peak of, say, the last economic boom. Unemployment. Now, this is a lagging indicator, but this is another way to look at it. Is if you look at the present economic situation. That's the unemployment rate is 9.3%. It's 9.293, something like that. But if you look at the partially employed, those people that are working, maybe 4 days a week instead of 5, had their hours pulled back, it's actually 16%. So that's 1 in 6 that are impacted by this present downturn, and that's expected to go up well over 20. Stimulus bill, how is that going to help? And this all gets back to this idea of, is this a permanent shift in consumer behavior? Is this a U-shaped? Is it a V-shaped? Is it, is it an L-shaped? I say it's an L-shaped. Only 20% of the bill is going to be spent on stimulus this year. The administration estimates that it's going to create somewhere north of 800,000 jobs, but just for comparison purposes, we've lost 8.6 million jobs thus far. So the stimulus bill isn't sufficient really to offset the kind of trends that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. When you get to buying this vineyard, you've got to say, is there going to be any banks like Silicon Valley Bank to finance it? And the good news is last quarter, it was the tightest credit conditions that there had ever been. This slide is a graph from the top 50 banks in the U.S. The Fed goes in and they interview and they say, are the credit conditions more tight or are they more loose than they were the prior quarter? And what you can see is that they're off of the worst place that they'd ever been. But largely speaking, they're still in a very, very tight place. So can you get credit if when you're going to go buy your vineyard? The answer is yes, but credit conditions are still changed. They're tight. Another thing is where we are with the total debt of the U.S. relative to GNP. With the spending bills right now before Congress, we expect that we're going to approach or exceed 100% of GNP in this administration, and that's a mark that goes back to Truman. When we start thinking about what that really means, and it makes the world nervous. You start hearing conversations from China and other places about, what are we doing with our spending, and part of what we've seen more recent. You listen to the bond traders in PIMCO, which is the largest bond fund in the world, and they're talking about a couple of things right now. One, the amount of debt that we're talking about taking on, the amount of stimulus that we're trying to throw at this problem as well. And the other thing is that people are feeling that maybe the risk is starting to come off, and this flight to the U.S. dollar, maybe it starts to unwind. When it unwinds and you still need to have those dollars held, you may have to increase rate. Third thing, you may start to see inflation. So all those things are driving toward higher rates. So when you're thinking about financing your winery, you also may end up paying higher long-term rates. So I don't know who these people are, but I didn't want to put one more slide in there that was that gloomy. So my son said this is Sailor Moon. I don't know who that is. I don't know if anybody's got young enough kids to know what that means, but that's that. All right. Very quickly, the wine business, the way it's set up right this second, you have to pick a point. On the left side of this chart is gross margin, and on the bottom is size of winery. Just to give you a sense, most wineries are pretty small. They're under 5,000 cases. But the way that the distribution side of things works now is the distributors are all consolidating, and so they want to go with bigger wineries. That forces the small guys to go direct. It's really hard right now if you're a small winery to get distribution. So you got to pick a path. I'm going to skip by that because you don't care. And there's plenty of wines, so don't worry about that. Let's see. So current business context. 2,700 wineries in California. So when you open your winery, you're going to be 2701. About 90 wineries in Santa Barbara, plus maybe some small ones that aren't on there. The top 10 wineries account for 82% of all domestic sales, and the top 8 distributors account for more than 90% of sales. Again, back to that problem of getting distribution representation for small-scale players. It's tough. Let's see. Average winery less than 5,000 cases, sell over $15 a bottle. And the second to the last bullet point, tools for the direct-to-consumer sales are emerging, and that's the internet side of things. And yet it's still very, very difficult. Really, when you think about it, people think the internet's been around for a long time, but really, for all intent and purpose, it started in like 2000, something like that. Remember back then when you brought up a page you'd bring it up and you'd go make a sandwich, and come back, and then you'd look at it, and then you'd maybe click the next link and go to the restroom and come back, and then when you look at it, there's no shopping cart. There's no real place to buy anything. So it was an entirely frustrating thing. But now we're seeing more and more sales done through the internet. But it's still a very difficult thing with not only the technology, but the fact that after Prohibition, the states were given the right to exercise control over the sale of alcoholic beverages, each individual state. So when you're trying to export from California to another state, it's like going to another country. If you were going to export, I hate to use that term, but if you're going to, let's just say ship. If you're going to ship your wine out of California, your new winery that you just built, to all the other states that would actually take it, you'd have to fill out 600 forms a month. That's the challenge you have in front of you with that model. The choice of your channel impacts it. So if you're going to go direct, it's a really cool thing. Going direct means that you're going to get the full retail value. When somebody walks into your tasting room and you give them a bottle of wine for $35, you get that $35. On the other side, though, if you're going to go through wholesale, when you give that bottle to the wholesaler, he gives it to the retailer. Retailer then gives it to the consumer. You only get about half of what you would get relative to what the consumer paid that walked into your tasting room. So on the one hand, the direct sale sounds very appealing. On the other hand, we just talked about some of the problems that are involved with that. The other thing is that's a one bottle sale at a time versus if you can go through distribution, you're selling a pallet, which I think is 34 cases? 44 cases, okay? So you'd rather sell a pallet, 44 cases of wine instead of one bottle at a time. It's a lot more effective. So different models and different choices, but each of those choices impact your profitability. Central Coast is a very bullish place, probably the most bullish outside of the Central Valley right now. We know this from survey data that we do, and I think rightly so. Not only are the wines outstanding, world class, but the property values start to make more sense relative to what can be consumed and purchased in the market. I'm going to skip by these gloomy slides. This says that the restaurant trade fell apart last year, and it did. Roughly 30% of wine in the fine wine segment is sold through restaurants. So when the restaurants fall apart, that's tough on the wineries. And I'm going to skip that one too. And you don't really care about that. There we go. This is one of the things that Silicon Valley Bank does. We have the dominant share of wineries on the West Coast. So we're able to take all the financial data that's all private, you can't get it, and stick it all together. And we can see how the wineries are really doing. I was just up at the Napa Barrel Auction a couple of weeks ago, and it's funny when you walk around, you listen to the owners, and they're talking to consumers and others, and gee, how's it going? And the answer is, great. It's always the same, and I have the financials, so I actually know. And it's just all marketing. It's things are okay, but great is a stretch. What you can see down here in the last three columns to the right, you'll see in 12/31/07, sales growth was about 22%. Really nice sales growth for this business. Again, since you're getting into the business, this is one of the things you got to think through. In order to sell wine in 2009, you actually have to crush that wine in 2007, basically, right? So you have to figure out, roughly 2 years ahead of time, how much wine you're going to want to sell, what the consumers' tastes are going to be, and what the market's going to look like. That's can be a very frustrating thing for this business, but that's one of the obstacles you're going to have. You can see on these last three things, we went from 12/31 to 9/30/08 to 12/31/08, and you can see the decrease in the growth rate from 22.3, 11.6, and the last one at 2% just shows you how bad that fourth quarter was. It was actually negative growth. That was in my 30 years in the business, that was the worst fourth quarter ever. I'm going to skip by all this stuff. But if you're interested in looking at a fairly comprehensive report, we do an annual State of the Industry report each year. These are the summary statements from that report. And if you contact me, I'll get you a copy of it. It's free. It's about 30 pages, and I think it's pretty good. I'll let you decide. So when you're thinking about this whole idea of lifestyle, in 2007 we did a 2007 we did a survey of the wine industry. About 500 people responded, 500 wineries responded, and we were asking them what are the greatest obstacles to sustain profitability, and 36% said distribution. Now this is obviously well before the market crash, right? But 19% said they were spread too thin, right? So when you're thinking about this being a working retirement, remember that 20% of the industry is already tired. And so what we end up with is this kind of a funny dynamic where a lot of the wineries actually started in kind of the 80s and even more so in the 90s, but a lot of those people are ready to transition to something else at this point. And at the same time, where their energy levels are going like this, the demands that are placed upon them are going like this. So it's something you have to jump into early, but it's a lot of work. If it's a working retirement, I don't want to retire. All right, let's see. A bunch of wineries sold. You don't care about that. All right, you do care about that. You do care about this. So now you got to think about what it's going to cost you for your vineyard dream. Okay, and we ran some numbers back there on acreage, and you look at it and you go, okay, well, 20 acres, that's about a 4,000 case winery. That's about right. So 20 acres, 40,000 an acre, it's 800,000. Well, if I can put a house on that, maybe I can do this, right? But you have to start thinking through the other costs that are in there. You have a development cost. You actually, when you plant your vines, you have 4 years before you get your first harvest. And then they have to be cellared for a couple years before you get your first sale of wine. All that has interest expense that gets layered on. And you have winery construction, that you have your equipment that you need, you have barrels that you're going to have for each individual vintage. The inventory actually does have a cost to it. People have to pick it, and it has to be watered, etc. So when it's all said and done, your small 20-acre vineyard actually ends up costing $5 million. Now the good news is that you can finance it if the banks are going to finance it. And so when you move to that, you don't need as much as $5 million. You can actually get by with a scant $2.1 million for your 20-acre dream. But thinking that through one layer more, if you sell all that wine, under the best conditions, these are very conservative numbers, it will take you about 16 years to break even on your investment. That's a long time. So if you're going to do it, you got to start pretty soon, would be my advice. So up in St. Helena, we see this happen all the time, where people say, I want to get into the business, and they start looking at it, they start working through the numbers, and inevitably this is what the decision is up in St. Helena. If you go around town, you see people, this is their vineyard dream. And this is actually my across the street neighbor. And the photo is courtesy of kwmcmillan.com. That's my son. He's a freshman at Arizona State in film. So please support him because you'll support me. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, gosh, Rob, after that presentation, I just might jump off Stearns Wharf after a delicious bottle of Pinot Noir. While I'm here, I want to give a plug for water. And I happened to be at the Environmental Defense Center fundraiser on Saturday when 2 young people riding from Vancouver to Mexico arrived on their bicycles with a huge amount of plastic materials that are consolidated in what's called the North Pacific Eyre. This is a high-pressure area in the North Pacific, and it's full of styrofoam and plastics that the fish are eating and the birds are consuming. And so much of it is the plastics, the huge volume of plastics just is discarded every day. So I carry a stainless steel water bottle, and I recommend it to everyone so we can get rid of the scourge. Anyway, I hate to be so down about it all. I think that what we really want to do is be enthusiastic about the wine business. And I was asked to just talk a little bit about the historical aspects of it, because wine growing is relatively new in Santa Barbara County. And I came here, as it turns out, a long time ago. I was telling Rob earlier that I am now called a legend, and to be a legend when you're still alive is really a challenge. But anyway, a pioneer or a legend, whatever it is, it's been a wonderful life that I've been able to experience here in this region. And frankly, when I first got to know the area, as many of you have, that if you didn't create something to do, you couldn't stay here. And so that was important for me to do. But I think we're all product of our time. And it turned out that I grew up in the 60s, or at least went to UCSB here. There were 24,000 students in 1961, and spent a year. I had an interest in geography, and so transferred to Berkeley and finished in geography. And people wondered what you would do with geography, but I thought it was such a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the world that we're living in. And little did I know that it was a really important thing to study when it came for what I was going to do in the future. But my development into business was terminated by being drafted into the Vietnam, what we think we call these days conflict, and spent 3 years in Vietnam. Coming back from that experience, recognizing that I had to be involved in something that was more earthly connected, and decided that agriculture would be the medium. And furthermore, I had a beautiful Volnay. And I thought to myself, if I could be producing an agricultural product that had the consistency of velvet, why not? As opposed to broccoli or some of the other crops that you might produce. Nothing against broccoli, of course, it's important. So I thought to myself, and this, frankly, was a very challenging time, having faced the rejection that occurred amongst so many Vietnam veterans coming back from that experience, that our culture really rejected the people who went to fight the war. It's curious in our whole cultural experience. It hasn't happened before, and thankfully it's not happening now that people embrace the soldier who are returning. But I decided that at that time I had to abandon the culture, and had an opportunity, or at least an inspiration, to be involved in agriculture and grow grapes that would be consistent with the kinds of Pinot Noir that was being grown in France at the time. And so I went back in the climate records to, excuse me, to the turn of the century, 100 years ago, and compared the climates of Burgundy with the climates of North America. And it was quite interesting to me that this transverse mountain range that so many of us here in Santa Barbara are familiar with, the mountains here running east and west, well, it's a geographic anomaly that allows for the westerly winds coming up the valley to moderate the growing climate. So you can choose the climate that you would like to plant the grapes or whatever crop within. In Lompoc, for instance, it's 68 degrees in the summertime, whereas in Lake Kachuma, 40 miles inland, it's 105 degrees the very same day. So I very excitedly started driving up and down the valleys with a thermometer in my car, and everyone thought this person has gone completely crazy, that grapes had not been grown here before, and farmers said grapes wouldn't grow here. But I had great confidence in the research that I had done, And I understand a lot of you are new entrepreneurs, and I would say that just have huge belief in your research. That it wasn't long ago I met Chancellor Yang at the university, and he was very interested in why I would plant the first vineyard in the Santa Rita Hills appellation of Pinot Noir, or of any grape. And it was interesting to be living at that time going through a whole paradigm shift of agriculture that farmers, you might imagine, are a very conservative group. So when I was planting vineyards there, they thought, well, this isn't going to work. And this is a very suspicious person. Actually living out on this ranch with no electricity, and it was called the Sanford and Benedick Vineyard in 1970, which we planted. But the reality was that Pinot Noir needed a very cool, long growing climate. And my prejudice was at that time that Napa Valley and Sonoma, the places that traditionally had Pinot Noir, were so warm that they were burning that beautiful sort of raspberry fruit quality out of the wine. And so the challenge, I can't tell you the challenge of trying to get people to recognize the potential for quality in Santa Barbara. Everyone thought that Santa Barbara is too close to the equator. It's got to be too warm for Pinot Noir. And the wisdom was the further north, and a lot of people at that time went to Oregon to plant Pinot Noir. But my feeling was it was the marine influence, it was the coastal influence that was really the dynamic factor. In fact, if you go far enough east anywhere in California, you'll reach desert. It just depends upon how far you are from the ocean. So we have a very unique environment here, and I've always believed in that. And started the vineyard in 1970 with a partner. But another thing I've been asked to talk about is some of the business dynamics of the decisions that I made along the way. Well, it was an inspiration, and it was a commitment to the place, and it was a matter of the timing, because at that point in time, it was very interesting that there were tax advantages to vineyard plantings, citrus grows, and cattle feeding for some reason. Sounds very legislative, but at any rate, that allowed me as a young person to go out and find some investors. But as Rob was saying, to find investors, and I was out there knocking on lots of doors originally. Well, you're going to have your first return in 7 years. It's a long-term project, the vineyard planting and growing. But for me personally, it was a great experience to find some investors that had the confidence in what we were trying to accomplish. And I'll always have a great feeling for that original investment, which fueled the Sanford and Benedick Vineyard. And to have that 1976 Pinot Noir come off as one of the stunning wines of well, I don't know, 10 or 20 years was really huge. I'm very grateful for having that experience. And someone asked me if I'm surprised, and I said, I'm not particularly surprised. I'm amazed at the way that the wines have been received and at the additional acreage that's been planted. But after the research that I had done, this is the way it's supposed to end up. But and I think that's the other lesson about some of the young entrepreneurs who are here, that believe that in the ultimate expression of what you're trying to accomplish, that it will happen if you really if you feel that it's going to happen. It really does. It's not all been entirely rosy, and I think it just happens to be. I think the Beatles talk about life happens when you're making other plans. That we have projected out our case sales and our growth and all of the stuff that we do, and I have to laugh in talking to Rob about this because invariably it doesn't quite happen that way. And I was counseled by a wonderful business person. Some of you may remember Carl Robinette here in Santa Barbara. In fact, I was watching the Wet Wednesday Regatta where I met my wife Tekla sailing on a Wednesday afternoon, and we live in such paradise here with sailboats going by. But Carl was an entrepreneur early on in Santa Barbara and said, Richard, when you finish all of your pro forma projections and your income statements and all that, well, just double the expenses and half the income, and then you'll have it. And it's so true that in all of the experiences that I've had, it ends up being about that ratio. And Rob, maybe you can speak to that as a banker, but I think to be an entrepreneur, you have to be an optimist and to think about how it can work rather than how it can't work. And Rob showed so many slides today that were so awful. But I just had to catch on the one that said the per capita wine consumption in California is going beyond recognition, or what did you say?
Over
3 liters per capita is going. You said something wonderful about abounding. So I'm focusing on that growth. I planted this vineyard in 1970, started the Sanford and Benedick vineyard with a partner, Michael Benedick, from Santa Barbara. And then in 1980, some of you have been through business experiences where you've had some issues with a partner. And so I left in 1980 to establish the Sanford Winery in 1981 with my wife, Tekla. We grew the Sanford Winery up to about 25,000 cases and built the winery of my dreams, finally, in the year 2000, and just in time for 9/11. And that was a really challenging time in the wine business. I didn't see the blip on the screen about 9/11, but restaurants stopped buying wine for about 10 months. And we just did not have the capital resources. If there's any time to be in business with a new building and deep debt, it was not 9/11. So we went out to find new partners, and it turned out that the Torlado Wine Group, who had the Paterno import company, became our partner and a marketing partner for us. And it turned out that we found that we had a different value system. And my wife and I had been involved in organic farming for about 23 years. Our vineyards are certified organic and have been for about 12 years. Some of our partners did not see the value nor wisdom in organic farming. So we were challenged with compromising our own value system, and so we chose to move on. And if there's any other thing, and I was talking to Bob about this earlier, about young entrepreneurs, and I would say, as an expression of how I feel, do not compromise your values. And I'll tell you, it's really challenging these days with the ethics considerations that we have before us not to. But at any rate, 4 years ago, we left the Sanford Winery, and we were lucky to have planted a vineyard on our own called the La Encantada Vineyard. And so we're using those grapes as the resource for the new Almarosa Winery, which was founded almost just 4 years ago. Using the experience that I've gained over the time, I've focused on, when you're a young winemaker, you want to make wines that are big, bold, statement kinds of wines. And as you drink wine, you recognize that balance and elegance are more important than impact. And so this has been a really exciting new challenge for me personally to create a new wine focusing on the quality of the grapes from our region, because the important thing is the place. That's the most important thing about wine. And there'll be a lot of marketing people who are telling you, well, we have the right place, or we have the right place. But the reality is that wine speaks of the place. And so these new wines of Almarosa Winery are speaking to the quality of the Santa Rita Hills growing appellation, which in this cool climate preserves the beautiful acidity and has a wonderful fruit component that we can ferment and put together in a wine that's really refreshing and appealing. Otherwise, the structure of the wine, the winemaking overwhelms the quality of the fruit, and then you have a fat wine that has too much oak or it's out of balance. So the first thing, I think, is the importance of balance in wine. So you'll notice that all of our Almarosa wines have a twist-off cap, that we were having big problems with corkiness in wine. This is a mustiness that's imparted to the wine by a bad cork. And so my feeling was, in creating this new winery, thanks to the New Zealanders and the Australians who have perfected or at least popularized the screw top closure, we decided to seal all of our bottles with a twist-off cap. Now, some of you my age and older may remember Boone's Farm and some of the what do we call jug wine with twist-off caps, and sort of the concept is that lower quality wines have a twist-off cap. But thankfully, we've been through that sort of introduction. Sommeliers and restaurant people are warming up to it beautifully. It's only our own prejudice that doesn't care. We don't hear the pop. We hear the little snap of the twist-off cap. But what Tekla and I have found is that twisting off the cap, having a glass or two, if you have any left to put in the fridge, it keeps beautifully for 4 or 5 days. So it's a great closure for the wine, I think. So what's happening today? And again, as these young entrepreneurs are coming along and thinking about their projects, I would suggest that find somebody who's really interested and passionate about all the numbers, because I really adhere to what Paul Hawken talks about with the three-tiered bottom line, that my wife and I are very interested and supportive of sustainability. All of our vineyards are organically certified and have been for 12 years. But Paul talks about the 3 Ps. It's the people, place, and profit. And I would like to say that as you were talking about measuring everything by dollars, and we've done this for a long, long time, but I think that we have to really look at enterprise in a different way and measure by the quality of how we treat the people who are working with us, and that's the people part of this. And then how we treat the place that we're doing the business within, and that's the place part of it. And so environmental considerations have been very important to us in the conduct of our business. And of course, the final issue is profit, that you can't have sustainability without profit in the business. And so plug that into the pro forma. So to me, I think we all have to be thoughtful about looking at a new sort of bottom line that incorporates all these parts. And I'm very proud to say that I still have guys that came to work for me in 1973. And so it's been almost 35 years that they're still working. And it works, and people are hugely supportive of the project. People are proud of what we produce. And I'm very proud of what we produce. And what we're trying to do now is to focus on very high quality wine at a reasonable price, because we understand that there has been a reset in the whole sort of economic picture. And so we're finding that white wines have to be $20 or less. Red wines want to be around $30, and we're making some adjustments. And luckily, we have our own vineyard so that we can adjust a little bit some of the crop loads so that we can offer a better price for some of the wines that we produce. But as Rob was saying, before you, well, I think that that so many people have heard the comment that how to make a small fortune in the wine business is to start out with a large one. And I think that there is a truism to that, that when I started in the wine business, we were bonded winery number 206, and now, as Rob showed in his slides, there are 2,700 wineries. So it's changed quite dramatically over those years. Anyway, it's been a hugely rewarding experience for me personally. It's been hugely challenging, going through a separation from some people that didn't have a different sort of philosophy. I think that we all sort of tend to personalize it too much, and if we can step back from that, and thankfully, in my experience in growing grapes in this region, I develop, and frankly, as I've thought back about my experiences in coming here, it's that connection that I made with nature that made it almost a spiritual experience for me, getting involved in business. Because that whole wartime sort of rejection allowed me to reject all of the other things that I had grown up with. And so I developed my own personal philosophy, very connected with nature, because all my involvement in the winery originally was sweat equity. I drove around the tractor for a lot of weeks, or a lot of years, actually. And when you drive around on a tractor a lot, you have a lot of time to think about stuff. And so I connected with nature and thought that my sort of philosophy was original. And then I learned about Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith, the great philosopher, spiritual or religious, a great teacher of religious studies at Berkeley, and learned that Taoism, the great Eastern spiritual tradition of Taoism, was exactly what my philosophy was. And so for me, the whole experience has been is a business experience and also a spiritual experience. And I'm very grateful to have built that into my background. So, there may be the bankers in the wings that are saying gloom and doom, but I do think I'm hugely optimistic that I'm thankful that our sales of Chardonnay are up 20% over last year. And it's a challenging time, but nonetheless, people are still drinking wine. And I think that life will go on. And we can be morose about it, but I think there are great opportunities. And there are challenges in agriculture, and there have been big challenges in being organic, but we like to face up to those challenges. And I just hope that all of you will come and visit us. We're up Highway 101, west of the town of Buellton in the San Ynez Valley on Santa Rosa Road. So we're in the same site that Sanford Winery used to be. And I want to make it quite clear. I had this name tag earlier tonight, and it said Richard Sanford, Omarosa Wineries, Sanford Wineries, and Sanford and Benedick. But I asked the young lady to cross out Sanford Winery and Sanford and Benedick, because this is a new chapter in my life, and it's now entirely Omarosa Winery, so I want to make that quite clear. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here and to share our wines tonight. if there are any questions anybody has at the appropriate time, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Brett Escalera and Jeff Newton to each describe a bit about what they do kind of day to day in the wine business, and then we'll move to some questions about all of what we've heard and questions from you. So I just remind everybody to speak into the mic, otherwise you won't be heard when you're on TV. So Brett, you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay. I should tell Richard that the 3 names on the name tag are my fault, because from the program we indicated that you were a serial entrepreneur and had started 3 different vineyards, and Cheryl, I don't think, understood that they were one at a time, so that's why you had all 3 on the name tag. Brett?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here, Bob. I guess I'll start with a little bit of background about myself. I was born and raised here in Santa Barbara County, so when it came time to make a decision about where I wanted to be with my winemaking career, it was pretty easy to want to return here to this area for a number of reasons. As Richard has said a number of times, it's a beautiful area, and we're blessed. And I think if you spend enough time traveling not only around the United States, but enough time traveling the world, I think you get an appreciation for what a great place this is. At the time that I was trying to make a decision about where I wanted to be for my winemaking career, Santa Barbara in many respects was still in its infancy. As Richard also mentioned, we're still a relatively young region when you look at the history of the California wine industry. And at that time, sure, there were some people that were established here, Richard being one of them. I still felt like there was great potential here in this area and great opportunity, and there still is. If you're an optimist, like I try to be, and I think Richard is, I think you see the potential here. So I started my career after my undergraduate days at Chico State University back in the late 70s and early 80s. And for those of you that are old enough and know the reputation of Chico State University for a future in the alcoholic beverage industry, it was a good place to start. I say that jokingly, but there is a certain amount of truth to it. I came back to this area and actually started in a career in real estate, but about 25 years ago took a part-time job at Santa Barbara Winery working in the cellar for Bruce McGuire, and worked there for several years before I decided if I wanted to have a future in this industry, at least the kind of future that I wanted, that I should probably go back to school and study winemaking. And so I did that. I returned as a graduate student to Fresno State University, graduated from there in the early 90s, and took a job at Byron Winery. At the time, it had just sold to the Mondavi Corporation, and I worked there for a season as the enologist, and then transferred over to Fess Parker Winery as at that point in time, their production manager. And a year later, my business partner, Tom Daughters, and I launched Consilience, which was now 13 years ago. And we have grown Consilience. The focus for the brand is primarily Rhone varietals. And it is roughly about a 12,000 case brand now. And 2 years ago, after a lot of, I guess, wringing of our hands, we decided to launch another venture. And we started Trai Winery. And we have a tasting room in Los Olivos that we established a little over, approximately 4 years ago, right before the release of the movie Sideways, which was very fortuitous. About a year and a half ago, we launched our second tasting room adjacent to the Consilience tasting room that coincided with kind of the downturn in the economy. not as fortuitous. But that's the cyclical nature of the wine industry, as Bob mentioned earlier. You know, sometimes it's a roll of the dice. So you do the best you can to forecast and project, as Richard has said, and you know, you try and cross all your T's and dot all your I's and hope that you can get it right. But it is a very capital-intensive business. What we make today is held by us for years before it's released to the consuming public. For those of you that are interested in producing alcoholic beverages, I suggest that the beer industry is probably a better choice right now, because you can make your product and release it in a few weeks, and if you do something wrong, you throw it away and you make another batch. In the wine business, you get one crack a year, and if you're fortunate enough, you get maybe 30 cracks in a career. Richard's probably surpassed that at this point, so he's beyond being fortunate. So, that's my brief background before we get started here. I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Brett. Well, when I was 5, my father brought me on my first visit to Santa Barbara. And some of you may remember that the McConnell's ice cream store was on Upper State Street, and that's one of the places we visited. I had an ice cream cone it was Dutch chocolate. They still have that variety of ice cream, and I still enjoyed it. It was winter time. It was December, very, very clear, blue sky, and I remember being outside the store, eating the ice cream cone, looking down towards the ocean with the completely blue sky, and thinking, this is a great place. And so when I made my decision later on to go to college, I applied at one place only, at UCSB. So I did an undergraduate degree, bachelor's degree in economics at UCSB, and came back and did a master's degree in econ. Along the way, I became interested in agriculture. I lived in the Sacramento Valley in Davis, and eventually studied viticulture, which is grape growing. And as I finished up and was trying to decide where I would do agriculture, there was really only one place, and it was Santa Barbara, which had a very nascent vineyard industry just beginning at that time. All my classmates at Davis were going to Napa and Sonoma, and they wondered why I was going to Santa Barbara, and it was because of the ice cream. So in 1984, I started a very small company, a vineyard management company. I had three small ranches, and I did all the tractor driving myself, and I ran my Hispanic cruise myself. It was all totally self-financed. No banker on earth would have ever loaned me money for that project. Today, our company, I have 3 partners. We manage 3,000 acres in Santa Barbara County. We have 40 different clients. Today, we have 600 people working for us. And I believe we're the second largest vineyard management company in Santa Barbara County. When I first started the company in 1984, I entered agriculture because I really loved agriculture. I had no impression that I would ever get rich. And today I'm still not rich. But I had a really, really great time. This has been a thrill for me, being able to enjoy the agriculture that I've loved for 30 years and enjoy it in Santa Barbara County, which is just a spectacular place.
Okay. To get things started, I'll ask a couple things, but when people get antsy and are interested in asking a question, just start to wriggle and squirm, and we'll notice. Rob, in your terrific summary, I'm actually sorry you skipped some of those slides. I had the advantage of getting to look at them earlier, and could take my time. But one thing you didn't talk about really was the current and potential future impact of imports of very good wines made in Argentina, Chile, New Zealand, etc., and the effect they could have over the next 10 years, the role of the dollar or the value of the dollar in that, all that sort of thing. It seems to me that could crush us if things went the wrong way.
Well, the interesting thing about the fine wine business is there's almost a natural hedge in one respect, because many of the fine wine producers have to buy French oak barrels, and those are about $1,000 a barrel right now. So on the one hand, you might have to struggle on the sales side, but on the other hand, you might get a bargain on a cost of goods. So there's a little bit of a hedge from that standpoint. But specifically to the question, the agricultural industry historically has run into this problem, whether it was cotton or sugar beets or pineapple or sugar cane. Inevitably, land costs get to a point and they go somewhere else. That's kind of what happens. And we've seen that happen in the Central Valley of California, where roughly 100,000 acres were pulled out of production starting about 5 years ago, and probably the following 2 years, about 100,000 acres. That's a lot of grapes pulled out of production, and largely it's because access to bulk wine internationally became more and more available. Last year, if I'm getting my numbers right, I think I should be close. There were something like 14 million cases equivalent of bulk wine that was imported from foreign countries and put into domestic brands. So when you're getting a big company brand, it's got a lizard or something on it, there's a distinct possibility it has no place. It is just something, it's Chardonnay, right? So that turns, what everybody up here would say is a labor of love into a commodity. So on the commodity side of things, we become very, very expensive. On the fine wine side, we also end up with one other problem, and that is there's some great wines that are produced worldwide. It's not just Europe now, but Argentina makes some great Malbecs. I love Spanish wines. And so if you're selling a $75 wine, you got to compete in a consumer's eye with a lot of other countries now. It was years ago when I was growing up, if you wanted to drink a foreign wine, you actually had to know where the producer, where the importer was. If you were in, let's say, San Francisco, you'd call up the guy in Berkeley and you'd say, do you have any of this? Or he would tell you what you have. The information was very, very hard to get. Today it's actually quite easy. You have the internet, and if you want to have a certain wine, you can actually compare. You can have something shipped from Chicago or Seattle or wherever you want. So that has a market impact on the business too. We have to be better, and we have to be better worldwide.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
There are wonderful wine-producing places all over the world, and they're going to be competitive price-wise with us. But I think if we focus on the quality of the grapes that are coming from our region, it overcomes the quality image of those wines. It's hard to be in the what's called, or maybe you coined the word, fighting varietal. I'm not sure, Rob, but the connotation is that these wines, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Cabernet, that are in the marketplace at $5 to $7 or $4, and these are called the fighting varietals. And it seems to me that most of the imported wines are in that sort of area. There are some very fine wines coming from South America, but they're a fairly finite production. But I do think that the fighting varietals may suffer from the challenge.
We have home court advantage for sure.
Yeah.
Not yet, Leslie. I'm sorry? No, yeah, but not yet. Let me have one more. There's sort of it seems like a set of forces that argue strategically that you should try to be in the higher than $15 part of the marketplace, and that you've got to build a brand so that you get a certain protection from these imports and other fighting varietals and such. And at the same time, the issue, or an unknown, which I think we may discuss more here, the impact of being able to go direct and how that fits with the smaller, 5,000 case winery, because it seems like as an entrepreneur at a small level, it's pretty tough to get big in this environment. And it's going to be equally tough to get your price to go up in view of the economy and what Rob is saying, and the expectation that even if wine prices go up in time, it is going to take a few years. So in the near term, we got to look at a static environment there. So I guess I come kind of strategically to the importance of marketing and branding and all that sort of thing to be successful and insulate yourself against some of these other competitive pressures. And I just wonder how anybody feels about that.
That's what keeps me awake at night. All those things. Really, as an entrepreneur, you think about all aspects of business and the challenges that we might face. And I think that the key is to just make as they say, a better mousetrap, to try and find something that appeals to people over and above what they can get from their other experience. So I'm very bullish on our region and the quality of our wines and how they're being received. And the challenge is to price them competitively for today's kind of marketplace, I think, truly.
We sell grapes to 80 different wineries, so we have an opportunity to speak with a lot of different winemakers on different scales and wineries that have different marketing strategies. It's been pretty clear to me recently, especially, that the wineries that are relatively insulated, not really insulated, but relatively speaking, are the ones that have pretty strong direct marketing, that they're selling, they have strong tasting room scenarios, or they have good wine clubs. And so I think they have been able to weather the storm, just from my own observation, pretty well. Now also, just in terms of any region, if you're trying to produce wine in any region of the world, you really want to do something that's special. You want to do something that's unique to the area, that the area produces well, and can be special. Special because of the specific soils involved, or special because of the climate. And so I think that's our greatest challenge in Santa Barbara County. We cannot compete with Argentina. Their land prices are dirt cheap. The labor is dirt cheap, and they're making some phenomenal Malbecs there. So if I were trying to go head to head with an Argentine Malbec for $10 a bottle, we're dead. So in Santa Barbara County, we have to find our own special spots and our own special varieties, and then we clearly need to be aware of our own labor situations. Our labor costs more than it does in places like Argentina and Chile. And so we need to be able to price those wines at higher levels. So for Santa Barbara County in the last 10 years, the development of Pinot Noir, Richard started. He was the first to plant Pinot Noir in the Santa Rita region. But it is a great Pinot Noir region. It's one of the great Pinot Noir regions in America, for sure. So we have a special advantage there. The Pinot Noir from Santa Rita is different than it is from Carneros. It's different than it is from Sonoma. It's different than it is from France. It's different and it's special, and we need to kind of lean on that as best we can. And I think if we produce the best wines we can, the best Pinot Noirs we can from Santa Rita, and price them appropriately, whatever that means, I think we can make a success of it. I also believe that Santa Barbara County is producing some of the greatest Syrahs in America, in the world. Beautiful wines. The winemaking skill in this county has accelerated beyond belief. It's unreal. So I think we have specific niches, and if we mine those niches, we can have successful businesses.
Just to add to what Richard and Jeff have said, going back to one of the slides that Bob had up there when he was talking about that $25 bottle of wine, and it sort of all began with the price of the land. And that was sort of at that point that price on that bottle had to be, just to realize, I believe it was a 12% return, which, you know, is
Pre-tax.
Yeah, pre-tax, exactly. There are other ways to skin the cat, so to speak. You don't have to go out and buy that land and plant that vineyard. You can do as I do and not build the winery. Go rent some space somewhere. There are entities out there that are set up now that allow for that sort of thing. And you go out and you purchase your grapes. And you become your bonded winery where you're leasing space in essentially a warehouse type building and nothing fancy. And as we've chosen to do, you go out and you find a retail location. We happen to be in downtown Los Olivos, and that sort of becomes your destination point. That was the approach that we took. And so the economics of what we're doing are a little bit different because we don't have that money tied up in land and development costs and bricks and mortar. Ours is tied up in the development of our tasting rooms and then in the purchasing of the fruit and barrels and that sort of thing. So it was a way to achieve what we wanted to achieve in sort of a less capital intensive manner. Having said that, it's still not easy. I like to be optimistic. I have to be optimistic right now because it's a tough time. There are a lot of new labels out there, not only from foreign competitors, but even domestically, even here in this area. I can remember when I got started 25 years ago, and there were maybe 30 labels in Santa Barbara County. Now there's well over 130. They're not all bonded wineries, but they're producing wine and they're vying for shelf space. And shelf space is becoming a precious commodity. And it's not just shelf space in a retail location, it's space on a wine list. And so you have to do things to distinguish yourself. You have to focus on quality. You have to be cognizant of price point. Having said all of that, it's easy to get hooked in this business. You go out and you purchase some fruit and you make some wine and you age it for a number of years in barrel and you get to that point where it's ready to bottle, and you make all the decisions you need to make about your packaging, and you finally get that product in bottle, and there's that sense of accomplishment. You think you've arrived. Well, I'm here to tell you, you aren't even halfway there. Now you got to sell it all. And that is really, honestly, that is the more difficult side of the equation. Because I can tell you, there are plenty of people out there that will sell you grapes. They'll sell you barrels, they'll sell you bottles, they'll sell you labels, corks, screw caps, whatever you want. They will line up at the door to sell you whatever the hell you want. When it comes time to sell your product, it's challenging. It's challenging. And Richard's laughing over here because, I am optimistic, but I also want to be realistic about how difficult it is. And really, if any of you in this room choose to go in this direction, I would go in the direction of conservatism. And I would go in the direction of starting small and taking it slow. And it's easier to let your eyes get bigger than your appetite in this business. I speak from experience. We were on a pretty tremendous growth curve with our brand, and current economic conditions have, caused us to step back and reevaluate and adjust, and we're doing so. And I guess that's my 2 cents on that.
So, Richard, I just have to ask you, Did you have anything to do with the movie Sideways where they said Pinot Noir, not Merlot? It was actually more explicit than that, or more dramatic, but that I think that affected sales of Merlot for a couple of years.
I had nothing to do with it. In fact, we were considering not even participating in the movie because we didn't know what the outcome was. And of any movie to talk about depression and alcoholism in the same movie, being a winery, we were very suspicious of the whole thing. But after we got to know the director and saw what they were trying to accomplish, we bought into their project. And it's a curious movie because it's a novel that takes place in a real place. Now, this is the movie Sideways. I don't know if all of you have seen it. I recommend it. That this is a road trip that a couple guys took in the Sanford Winery, which is now the Almarosa Winery, is the first stop that they took on their road trip. And the whole point was to find the perfect Pinot Noir. And interestingly, the person who wrote the book, Rex Pickett's, actually wrote these different wineries into the book originally because of the quality of their wines. And so when it came time to make the movie, Alexander Payne, the director, went to see some of the different places that he had suggested were quality wines, and he was overtaken by the places. And so it's a very curious movie that way, and when you watch it, you'll see that that here are these characters in a real-life place, and so consequently, after the movie, there were people coming to relive the experience and having picnics in the walnut groves along Santa Rosa Road and drinking too much wine along the way. But if those that you saw the movie remember, there was a wonderful soliloquy that talked about Pinot Noir as the quality that it was. And this is the way we talk about wine. It's the passion that you talk about wine with all the expressions of wine that we as winemakers talk about. But, you know, those experiences, those taste experiences are available to all of us. And it's a matter of reflecting on what our experience has been in tasting Pinot Noir, tasting any wine, and how it relates to other kinds of things that we've tasted. But there was a magic in it all. And Virginia Madsen, in this soliloquy, was so beautiful in expressing all these wonderful nuances of Pinot Noir. So if you have a chance to see the movie, and Virginia Madsen comes on talking about Pinot Noir, pay attention because it's wonderful. But I am so stunned at how the media can change huge national perception, because after that movie, our Pinot Noir sales began to incline rather dramatically, and I think Rob can speak to Merlot sales dropped off dramatically. And as somebody who has seen the movie, it ends up with the character drinking a wonderful Merlot out of a plastic cup, a styrofoam cup in the end, with a hamburger of all things. But and so what to me it exposed Pinot Noir to a much larger audience, and I have known the beauty of Pinot Noir for a long time. But you know, people started out in California wine drinking with Cabernet, and then people decided they wanted the softness of Merlot because it didn't have the tannin structure of Cabernet. And what really people wanted was moving on from Merlot to Pinot Noir, which has this beautiful fruit and doesn't have the tannin of either of them. And so it introduced people to a huge new opportunity in wine, and it carries through today, I think.
Okay, Leslie, I'll let you go first.
So I'm Leslie Edwards. I'm Director of corporate business development at UCSB, and I've been drinking Pinots from out of Santa Barbara for years, probably 25. I spent my 10th anniversary at Sanford Winery with 10 other couples. So my question, had more to do with my new question, because I think this is important, and Richard brought this up. Is it really an evolving condition that wineries that are certified, organic, are kind of paving the way, or is it just kind of the outliers? I'd love to see that, it's more of the norm. And, is it really helping wine growth in that region, to be organic?
Thank you, Leslie, and I'm sorry I didn't talk a little bit more about that when I addressed you earlier, but there has been a huge disconnect between organic farming and winemaking, because typically people have had an upcharge for organic vegetables and fruits and that sort of thing. But in the wine business, actually, organic has been a negative, because the wine cognoscenti do not find that the organic wines are quite appealing. Unfortunately, that organic wines cannot contain sulfur dioxide, which protects against oxidation. That's that matterization that occurs in wines, the sherry-like expression. And you don't want sherry-like expression in Chardonnay, for instance. The way we preserve the fruitiness of the wine is to add sulfur dioxide to the wine to protect it. Well, since we add sulfur dioxide, we can't call our wines organic. And if the wine cognoscenti is rejecting organic, well, then we're off to a really poor start, unfortunately. Organic farming costs 5 to 7, even 10%, Jeff would say, more than conventional farming. I think back when I was driving around a tractor thinking about all these sprays I was spraying into the land. I thought that these sprays, these chemicals have to be getting into our groundwater resources somehow. And Tekla and I were eating from an organic garden, and she suggested, well, why don't you just grow the grapes organically? And I said, well, that's a big challenge, but I'm very happy that 23 years ago we weaned ourselves of all chemical herbicides and pesticides, because I was recognizing that these sprays have to be getting into our groundwater. And by the way, how were people farming these grapes before the Second World War, before these chemicals were invented? And so in doing some research, I recognized that they were taking care of weeds through mechanical cultivation, through a French plow that would go underneath the vine row and move the weeds aside. We use good bugs. We add bugs into the mixture so that if we have enough healthy good bugs, they'll take care of the bad bugs. We have to be a little bit more inventive and be thoughtful about any issues that might be coming up. To be an organic farmer, I believe the most important thing to be an organic farmer is that you believe that it's possible, because some people don't. And if you go back into some of the old ways of doing things, we can be organic, and I feel that our organic vineyard really I can't quantify that through a tasting experience, but I can tell you that visually an organic vineyard looks much healthier at harvest time than a conventional farm. I hate to say conventional, because in 1940 conventional farming was organic farming, and the convention has changed over time. But the reason to be organic these days is because how you feel about things. There's not an economic advantage, unfortunately, to be an organic grape grower. And to some of the young entrepreneurs that we were talking about, Bob, that young people are here, I would say, again, that's a conviction that you have to have in putting your business model together. If you think that organic farming is part of your process, then you have to plug that into the pro forma, and that's what you have to achieve. It's not something that later on you can say, well, we're going to save 10% by not organic farming. And so really it's a philosophical commitment that you have to make, I think. And it's challenging, I'm proud of our organic status, but I'm shy to talk about it in the, with the wine connoisseurs because they find it as a negative. And so it's a real contradiction, unfortunately. That is changing.
Rob, do you see that broadly, that this view of organic versus regular?
Well, yeah. Let me back up one step. Back up 2 steps. There we go. Get plugged in first. There's an axiom that change creates opportunity, and we're certainly in a period of change. That's why the administration is trying to force through such large spending measures with healthcare and such. This is an opportunity to reshape because of the surrounding. Richard and I had this conversation probably a year ago, and I would have gone with his answer a year ago. I would have said, yeah, I mean, in the case of a consumer looking at a bottle, one's organic, one's not, both same price, both same quality, it's a tie, maybe organic wins. That's about the best you can do. But I think in this environment, people are looking for authenticity. Largely, the consumer doesn't trust what they used to know, so they're looking for something else. So this is an opportunity, I think, for perhaps on the wine side, the organic side of things actually to maybe take a little bit higher visibility. And as it relates to brands, I want to make sure that people understand brand building is about creating value, and there's a mistake that people make that value is cheap, right? That you want the cheapest thing out there, and that's absolutely fraudulent. It's not what people want. It's not what anybody in this room wants. You don't want the cheapest wine, right? That's not what you guys drink, probably. The definition of value is perceived quality divided by price. Go ahead and drop your price, but that's the only thing you got. Right? There's a lot more things you can do with perceived quality. So I'm hopeful that in the future that wines such as Almarosa will be recognized for the work that they do in the vineyard and actually get that premium that not only deserved, but I think is also in the bottle. But that perceived quality has to come forward first, and there's got to be ways that you can market and present those things to a consumer so that they actually do feel like there's authenticity in that product. And I'll get off my bandwagon in a second, but the 90s were a period and the early 2000s of bling, right? You don't see people wearing bling anymore. Everybody's pulling back from that. So I think that today, as we move away from the kind of things that we were used to, something can walk into that space, and I'm hopeful that organic is one of those.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff. Sure.
Excuse me. If I could just say a couple of things here. So, our Earth is in big trouble right now, and from my perspective as an agriculturalist, it's important for me to do my best to reduce the amount of kind of toxic pesticides that we're putting out there in the environment. So, to that end, we have a number of different clients, and those clients all have different sort of they make decisions in different ways. And if I had my way, I would grow all of our grapes organically. As it is, we have 6 vineyards that are organically farmed. 3 of those are certified. 3 are farmed organically but not certified. We have another 2 or 3 vineyards that are biodynamically farmed, which is way out there. It may be voodoo, but you could do it. As Richard said, if you have a will to farm in a certain way, you can make that happen. So you can do that with we've made that happen with biodynamics. We've made that happen organically. I would say, by and large, most of our vineyards are farmed in a sustainable way, which is a bit of a loaded concept for both organics and biodynamics. There's a very specific certification process. There are certain standards that you need to meet. With sustainability, there is also a fairly clear list of guidelines. However, we do not have the certification. I would say that probably 75 or 80% of our vineyards are farmed sustainably, and we're pretty far down the sustainable curve. That is to say that we're using very, very few chemicals, very soft materials, low rates of those materials. So I think we're a step or two away in many cases from being organic on those sustainable ranches. But I would say this, that while I think organic farming is a great thing to do, biodynamic farming is a great thing to do, the steps that have been made in sustainable agriculture in the last 20, 25, 30 years have been significant in reducing pesticide use to the tune of at least 50%. And as I said, and in terms of soil health, our regard for soil health and how we deal with our soil in terms of using more compost and gypsum and leguminous cover crops and that sort of thing. These are things that when I was at Davis were not only not talked about, but they were berated. So in a lot of ways, we've moved significantly forward, and we still have a huge way to go.
I'm Ray Estrada with the Daily Sound. I'm a business writer, and I've been drinking Santa Barbara wines for 25 years, and they taste much better here than anywhere else. But I was going to ask, are any of you concerned about California's climate change laws, like AB 32 and other things that are going to change the way fuels is made and burned, for your distribution costs? Would that affect that? And also in land use, there are also some laws coming up that would affect the way land is used, especially in a place like Santa Barbara. So have any of you heard about that, or have any concerns about AB 32 or such measures?
Thank you for consuming Santa Barbara County wines.
A lot of yours, too.
Yeah. There's a huge amount of controversy over agricultural land right now and how it should be used, and there are issues of development and what's the wisest and best use. And thankfully, we are actually hosting a group called the AFA, the Agricultural. Oh gosh, it's
Farmers of America.
It's an agricultural farming alliance, or it's a group that meets at our place on a monthly basis to talk about the interface between agriculture and culture. That what do we want in the future of Santa Barbara County? This is getting people in the Santa Barbara County Farm Bureau together with the environmentalists, and boy, is that an issue. And we've been meeting there for 2 years. Thankfully, the Environmental Defense Center has been very helpful. Eric Cardenas is really the inspiration for this. But they're beginning to discuss how serious agriculture can interface with the growing need for housing and create the buffer zones around communities that need some sort of space from pesticide use. And so there is a great local movement about all of this. As far as AB 23, I can't speak to it exactly, but I do know that in Santa Barbara County, people are trying hard to look at alternatives.
Nobody's standing at the mic. Rob, one thing that you said that was sort of discouraging was the interstate shipping mess, which, it's gotten to the point, at least a couple of years ago, FedEx and UPS would no longer take a wine shipment. You had to say it was olive oil or something. What do you see there? Is there anybody who can cut that Gordian knot?
Well, first of all, back to the state thing. The larger issues with the state for me are the budget mess and what's going to happen with taxation. It used to be that whenever we ran out of money, we would look to sin taxes. You'd start taxing alcohol and cigarettes and such. And I've seen a lot of discussion about taxing, a nickel a drink and such. And so those are the things I think that would negatively impact this, despite the fact that wine is generally viewed almost universally now as a healthy thing in moderation. Your other question about interstate commerce, there was called the Granholm decision that was made about 4 years ago now, and the question was how much license were states allowed over the movement of alcoholic beverages in their own states, and relative to the Commerce Clause, which was dormant at the time, but it basically said, look, we're going to separate out, this is the constitutional thing, we're going to separate out as states, but we still want to make sure that states are encouraging commerce state to state. And what ended up happening with wine in particular, there were a number of states that would say, okay, look, you can ship all you want in your own state, but if you're coming from out of state, you can't ship. And so that was the end of that ended up being viewed as unfair. And the Granholm decision started to unwind that piece of prohibition. So the good news is that it is easier now, and there are a lot more states that you can ship to. The bad news is that prohibition or the Granholm decision didn't lump all these laws into one. We have 50 different states with 50 different laws. And there's no way around that. That's just a bureaucratic mess. The way that people get around it right this second, there are several businesses that have figured out exactly what to do, and technology is what's helping accomplish this. Micro-billing, if you guys are up on that, your iPod kind of a thing, you can download a song, 99 cents. It's the same kind of a thing. If you want to ship your wine to a certain state and they have certain laws that say, okay, well, you have to pay a license fee to start, and then you have to ship it through, or it has to go through a distributor and then a retailer, and then it can go to the consumer. What ends up happening is you create this paper trail where people are passing paper back and forth and doing this micro-billing for their bottle, and they're collecting 90 cents in their checking account for doing effectively nothing. And then but the physical bottle can go to the home. So it's kind of a nightmare to get, it doesn't make any, it's the camel that, is the horse that's designed by the committee approach to direct shipping, but it's getting there. It's just kind of a pain in the butt, and it's better than what we had.
There's always a business out of everything, right? Any other questions from the audience? Well, it's really not possible to sum up something as big as this. The one bit of a takeaway I got was that if you're a 5,000 case or smaller winery, that going up market, building your brand, learning a lot about the internet and going direct to the consumer is probably and also staying financially conservative, not getting over leveraged so that you can live through unpredictable downturns like 9/11, et cetera. But that's a strategy that would make sense for somebody who's starting out small or who buys a small one for $5 million or whatever. Well, I want to thank you all for a very interesting evening. This was, all of us have been drinking wine, but none of us have understood very much about how it gets there. And I think this was really good. Thank you.